Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about one of the most frequently asked questions that I get on the channel, which is, Chris, what kinds of filmmaking gear do you use and what types of equipment do you take into the backcountry to make your videos with? And so tonight, we're going to be getting right into it. Before we get into what's in the bags, I should probably mention that I currently film in the backcountry with a Panasonic G9, which is essentially a GH5. The GH5 is a more filmmaker-oriented camera, but I went with the G9 because the G9 has one extra stop of stabilization in it, and I'm kind of fussy about creating super smooth shots. I like to film with gimbals. I like to film with cameras like the G9 that have image stabilization on the sensor, image stabilization in the lenses, and then I'll add a little stabilization in post sometimes, and I'll even keyframe the rotation to keep the horizon level. I'm really obsessive about super smooth shots in the backcountry sometimes, and I also really love to film with really long telephoto focal lengths. The reason why I'm kind of drawn to that is because a number of years ago I watched a documentary called The Art of Flight, and they filmed a lot with a camera system called a Cineflex. And a Cineflex is essentially a really expensive gimbal with really expensive cameras strapped to it, filming at incredibly long focal lengths. And it creates a really interesting look that you don't see very often because it's much more difficult to keep longer focal lengths smooth and stable than it is to keep wide angle shots smooth and stable looking in appearance. And those shots just looked incredible. And so I've sort of been chasing after that look because I find it really interesting. And yeah, I'm always just trying to create something that looks different or interesting or unique. So yeah, I feel like this setup with the G9 and the 3-axis gimbals that I'm going to show you in a moment are a really good mix between decent production value while also being quick, lightweight, and nimble. It's also built like a tank, so I can take it through, goodness, just about any weather conditions out there in the backcountry that I might throw at it. We also carry a lightweight tripod with us in the backcountry. It's a carbon fiber tripod, which I'll show right now, that has a Manfrotto fluid head on it, and we tend to strap that to the back of one of the backpacks. Now, before we get into what's in the bags, I want to mention to you folks that later on in the video I'm going to be mentioning a tip that I think is actually more important than the gear itself. I mean, the gear does, of course, matter, but I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on what I think you should actually consider when you're thinking about making films in the backcountry. And I don't want you to come away from this feeling like you need to have all this. And this is the typical setup that I would use for, say, a week-long filming trip in Algonquin Park. And a lot of this gear can fluctuate or change depending on the trip. Okay, so while tripping in the backcountry, we have the camera bag and we have the power generating bag. The total weight of all the film gear is probably pretty close to, for this gear list, pretty close to about 25 pounds. But again, if we were doing something like the Misc Link, we might pare it down to somewhere between 15 to 20. I should mention, I always look out for our gear, but I don't baby our gear. I typically keep the camera system out and accessible, unless it's like just sheathing rain. But even then, sometimes I'll essentially keep the camera out and just, put something protective over top of it. But it's always at an arm's length reach away. At nighttime, I will sometimes then put the camera system back in the dry bag. The dry bag opens up quite a bit in case I want to put the camera on top of it. So first thing on the list is the dry bag, in which it all goes in itself, which is a C-line dry bag. It's clear. I much prefer this to a Pelican case. I'm not a fan of Pelican cases. I know a lot of people use them in the backcountry, but I just think they're really cumbersome. This bag is clear, so I can just reach in, see what I'm getting really quickly and pull it out. And what I also love about this bag is you can take this loop on the top and you can clip it onto a gear haul loop on your backpack and just let it suspend from the front of your backpack as you're going down the portage. These bags are incredibly durable. We've had these dry bags for almost 10 years now, and not a single leak, not a single tear. They've stood up to years and years going down portages and getting bumped and held up to everything. And you effectively have a protective bubble around your gear that is just way lighter than a Pelican case. I love it. So when in the backcountry, I always carry an action camera like a GoPro. This is the GoPro Hero 8. It's a fantastic camera, great image stabilization. And one really important thing to note about GoPros in the backcountry is GoPros don't float. So pair it with something that does float. This is the actual GoPro floaty, and it's been stuck onto the bottom of a clamp mount for the GoPro. So I can clamp this onto a life jacket. I can clamp this onto the boat itself. This is actually in a protective foam windscreen that actually keeps the wind off the microphones, improves the audio quality, and I love this camera. Okay, so we've got the Rode Video Micro. This is a great microphone in the backcountry with a dead cat that comes with it that keeps the wind noise down. Having said that, and I have filmed with a lot of microphones, a lot of external microphones on the cameras over the years. When it comes to filming in the backcountry, believe it or not, I actually tend to film with the onboard mics on the camera because I tend to add narration as I'm filming Julia sometimes. And if I'm filming with a shotgun mic like this, a directional mic that's aimed at Julia, and I talk, it does a less than stellar job at picking up my voice as I'm behind the camera, but we will put micro windjammers on top of those microphones so that it does keep the wind noise off them. When I do need a directional mic, great choice. Next is a mini GorillaPod, and what I use this GorillaPod for is actually propping up another piece of film gear that I'm actually using at the moment, which is a Zoom H1. This is a great field recorder to have in case you want to capture external audio. A GoPro tripod, little extendable tripod. We've got the head mount for the GoPro. This is a GoPro mount that can be strapped or wrapped around something. Chesty GoPro mount for positioning the GoPro right in front of you. This is a great point of view if you're showing what you're doing with your hands. A clamp mount for the GoPro, extra adhesive mount for the GoPro, joints for the GoPro mounts, tripod mount for the GoPro. Next up is the Nova AW Low Pro gear bag. In the side of the camera bag, we carry an SD card vault. We carry about a terabyte worth of card space. I know that's kind of crazy, but after a week of filming in 4K, between 2 to 3 hours of 4K per day of a trip, we come actually pretty close to filling up an entire terabyte worth of storage space, especially if I'm doing things like shooting high-res time lapses at night. The cards that I typically use in cameras like the G9 are SanDisk Extreme cards. I'm going to link to them down below. And for the card size, I typically use about 256 gig cards. That's the size that I like to roll with, so that if one of them goes, hopefully only about a quarter of the trip is going to go. There's a wipe for the LCD screens. We've got a set of headphones in case I need to monitor the audio out of the G9 or out of the H1. A microfiber cleaning cloth. We've got Rycote mini windjammers. These go over top of the microphones that are on your camera. These are great things for keeping the wind noise down. It lets your camera's automatic gain control be able to function correctly and actually pick up and level the audio as it should. And these are fantastic for doing that. Moving on to the front of the camera bag is where we store all the batteries for the cameras, and we'll take 5 batteries for each camera. And so 5 batteries for the primary, 5 for the GoPro, and 5 for the backup camera. And they're not all here because some of them are sitting in on the gear shelf in my office. When we arrive at a campsite, getting batteries charging is one of the first things that I do. And we tend to charge directly off the field batteries that I'm going to get to in a moment. But keeping those topped up is done with solar panels that we're going to get to later on in the video. So the first thing that's at the top of the camera bag on the inside is a business card. That way somebody can contact you if your bag is lost. Super valuable. Another wipe for the LCD monitors. The first thing that's in the main compartment of the camera bag is our first field battery. This is a 25,000 milliamp RAV power field battery. It has its own flashlight on it if you wanted. It has its own solar panel on it. Keep in mind the solar panel on this is pretty small, so it would take an incredibly long time to charge this battery if you're depending on this one solar panel alone, but it's nice to have that extra little bit of redundancy. I also like to have a post-it note on the back which keeps a running tally of how many battery draws I've taken out of it. And that really just kind of lets me know the general performance of this battery over time. So if I notice it decreasing over a series of trips, it might lead me to replace it at some point in the future. I just want to make sure that I'm always well prepared for power. Next up is our backup camera body, which in this case is a Panasonic GX85. We actually filmed the Far North Algonquin series with this camera body, which I'll link down below. Interesting side note about that series. We had to name it the Far North Algonquin series because we already had a Northern Algonquin series, so we simply just wanted to differentiate it that way. But we weren't actually implying that Algonquin Park is far north. We were just saying Far North Algonquin. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. That's where I was born and raised. That is much further north than Algonquin Park, and I don't even think Sault Ste. Marie is far north. Next up is a rocket blower. This is fantastic for blowing the dust off your sensor. This was in my one invaluable tip for outdoor filmmakers and photographers. I'm going to link to that video down below in case you missed it, but yeah, great item to keep dust off your sensor and keep those images dust-free and dirt-free. Next up, we have a backup portable field drive, and this is fantastic for backing up your memory cards at the end of the day. You can simply pop the memory card in the side, and it's a My Passport Wireless Pro. It's a little finicky sometimes, but this is excellent peace of mind in the backcountry, knowing that if you lose a camera system or a card is corrupted, you're going to be able to hold on to that backup and keep the show rolling. Next up is our second large battery bank, and this particular one is a Brenton battery bank. I think it's 10,000 milliamp hours, but this one works specifically with one of the solar panels that I'm going to get to in a moment. Okay, so next up are the 3-axis gimbals that we use in the backcountry, and on this side we've got the Pilotfly H2. This is the first one that we started taking into the backcountry with us. Not the first gimbal that I ever filmed with, but the first one that I took into the backcountry. And this is the Pilotfly Adventure gimbal. Filming with 3-axis gimbals like these in the backcountry does make things a little bit more cumbersome, but my filmmaking brain just knows how good the shots look when you combine a camera like the G9, which has its own image stabilization, with a 3-axis gimbal. It just creates a beautifully smooth looking shot, akin to a Cineflex at a longer focal length. I tend to take this on shorter trips or during the winter when I know it's going to get hammered by snow and moisture. This is the older H2, and then I'll take the newer Adventure gimbal during the drier months in the summer. It's a lighter gimbal, slightly lighter than this one, but yeah, I love filming with these in the backcountry. So that wraps up everything that would be in the first dry bag, and we'll get to the second dry bag in just a moment. But before I do, I need to take a brief moment to thank the awesome folks over at Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. You can explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity there. They have a tremendous range of interesting classes on topics from film and video production to marketing and productivity, to music production, fine arts, animation, graphic design, photography, along with so many other really interesting creative topics. And I taught myself from nothing but online filmmaking resources many, many years ago. So I thought I'd take a look at what Skillshare has to offer in that regard. And they have a fantastic course by Simon Cade, who teaches you everything from getting started in filmmaking and basic principles all the way up to advanced topics. Definitely worth checking out if you're thinking about getting into filmmaking. Great resource. And it's curated specifically for learning, meaning there are no ads and they're always launching new premium classes, so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. And it's less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. However, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click on the link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership to try at no cost to you. You can give it a shot, see if you like it. Clicking on that link in the description really does help out the channel, so I'd appreciate it if you could please take a look. And again, a huge thanks to the folks at Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And without further ado, on with the rest of the show. Okay, on to the second dry bag, and I should mention before I get into this one, I'm also going to be talking about camera settings and some of the lenses that I use after this, so stay tuned for that, along with a tip. Again, super easy to find whatever you need in the bag. You can leave a little bit more air in them, and so the whole bag ends up being a little bit more inflated and creates that protective bubble around your gear. So this is the first of 2 solar panels that we carry in the backcountry. This is a Brunton Solaris 28, I believe, 28 watt panel, and it's held up to so many years of backcountry tripping. Great panel, highly recommend it. It can fill a 10,000 milliamp battery bank in about 6 to 8 hours, I'd say, on average, with really good coverage. I think I bought this about 10 years ago. Probably wouldn't need a backup panel if you had 28 watts of a solar panel with you, but I do like to have a backup just in case. Okay, so our backup panel is a Goal Zero Nomad 10, and what I really appreciate about this particular panel is it's conveniently sized to be able to fit within the backpack footprint, meaning you can keep it on the back of the backpack all day long if you want, without it sort of wrapping around the pack and, you know, possibly getting bumped and bruised. And I've been really happy with it. Super durable. It was pretty much on the outside of the backpack for the entire Misc trip, for the entire 420 kilometers around the park, and lived out there the entire time. We did take the 28 watt panel with us on the Misc as a backup to this one, but this was the primary one that was always out on the pack, charging day in and day out. Held up to a lot, great panel. We've got a charger for the main camera, would come off of USB on the battery banks. And this is one, and I would actually carry another that's in the office that is a double charger, so that I can charge 3 at once off a battery bank and then also charge one directly from the camera itself. You can charge the camera battery while it's in the camera, so I can charge up to 4 batteries at the same time. Cable for charging the headlamps, cables for the solar panels, more specifically the Brunton panel, to be able to pull power from either directly from the panel or to be able to charge into the Brunton power bank. And we've got a 12 volt barrel plug on one of the cables that can go directly into a USB car adapter. We've also got a 75 watt inverter that takes that 12 volt barrel plug and converts it into a regular plug for anything that you might need to plug in the backcountry. We've got plug-in power cables for the gimbals, USB to Lightning cables, and we'll usually carry about 2 of these just in case one of them breaks, but we really like to keep the cell phones powered in the backcountry so that we can use them as timekeeping devices, or sometimes we'll use the cameras on the cell phones in the backcountry. Keep in mind, you'll often not have cell phone reception in the backcountry, and we really wouldn't want to use our phones in the backcountry anyways because we're trying to get away from that, but just keep in mind you won't have cell phone service in the overwhelming majority of the backcountry. It's nice to use Avenza maps with Jeff's map in the backcountry for navigation sometimes as an addition to your backcountry map, your paper map, of course. Keeps our phones going. USB charge cable for the field hard drive. Charging base station for the battery in the Adventurer gimbal. USB to micro USB cable. This is a triple charger for the GoPro, so I can charge up to 3 GoPro batteries at the same time. I like to carry a waterproof notepad along with a Sharpie, and I find this really useful. Sometimes I like to make notes about the settings that I was using on a camera for, say, a time lapse at night, for example, with a particular lens. So yeah, make note. Extra barrel plug for 12 volt out from the battery if I need. And I should mention the Brenton battery can do 12 volt, 16 or 19 volts out DC in case I need it, in addition to USB out. So a lot of versatility in this particular battery. And last but not least is a universal charger for lithium-ion batteries. It runs off of a 12 volt car adapter plug, and so I can put it into that barrel plug that I just mentioned. But what's really interesting about this is the top slides back and forth to then sandwich and hold onto a battery, and inside it has a positive and a negative terminal that can slide back and forth on a track. And all you have to do is you have to line up the terminals, the positive and a negative terminal, on whatever battery you want to charge, provided I'm pretty sure it's got to be a lithium-ion battery. Sometimes it's a little janky because you have to position it just so that the leads are in contact, but this will get the job done in a pinch. So yeah, that wraps up everything that we carry in the dry bags in terms of filmmaking equipment and power generating equipment. If you're filming with a smaller camera or a GoPro or a cell phone, or you're just filming in 1080p and you're not filming in 4K on 3-axis gimbals, then your energy requirements might be a lot less, and you could probably get away with just carrying some extra batteries with you rather than generating power in the backcountry. So consider that. However, I personally find myself upgrading my camera system about every 3 years, and I'd prefer to have a longer term solution that can grow with me as I move from camera system to camera system. The solar setup also helps me if I'm filming for a client and I have to rent a specific camera for that particular shoot, so it's flexible in that sense. And it's also just really fun to film with solar sometimes because it makes you appreciate the energy that you're filming with in the moment so much more when you know that you collected it yourself, especially out in a really remote area. There's just something about that that makes me appreciate the energy that I'm using. Now, when it comes to lens selection in the backcountry, I like to take 2 general types of lenses with me. I like to take a multi-purpose zoom, and I also like to take a really fast manual prime. For example, right now I'm filming with a Nikon 50mm f1.4 that's been adapted to this G9. It effectively gets me a really fast lens, and I love shooting in manual. It's how I got started in filmmaking so many years ago. This particular 50mm, when it's on the Micro Four Thirds system, effectively becomes, with the crop sensor and the crop factor, essentially a 100mm equivalent on a full frame. It's actually been adapted with a focal reducer or a speed booster, which multiplies that number by 0.72 and reduces the crop factor and essentially gets you a 72mm equivalent that has kind of like a portrait range to it. So it's nice for shots like these in low light. It's great for low light shots in the backcountry. And the other lens that I'll take into the backcountry with me is a multi-purpose zoom lens, like a 12 to 60mm lens on the Micro Four Thirds system, which would be a 24 to 120mm equivalent on a full frame sensor. But that gets me some great wide shots, it gets me some mid shots, it gets me some telephoto if I want it to be able to reach across a lake. Or I can create lots of compression if I'm really close to something and I'm using all that zoom. And it's also a bit of a macro if I'm really close to something and using all that zoom. So I'll generally use that multi-purpose zoom lens on the gimbal while I'm filming throughout the day. And then at nighttime, I'll put on the fast manual prime lens, and I've got a great low light combo. Now, when it comes to camera settings, I'll generally film at 24 frames per second or 23.98, and that's typically a frame rate that people associate with images that look a little more cinematic. 30p is traditionally associated with television, and then higher frame rates like 60p you'll sometimes see in video game videos on YouTube, or you'll use 60p to create slow motion when you conform 60p to 24 later on in post, and slow it down to less than half the speed if you're conforming into 24p. So yeah, I generally film in 24p. Sometimes I play around with the shutter angle because I've found sometimes when I get sharper edges on my images by having a higher shutter angle and less motion blur, I actually get better image stabilization results out of the stabilizers in Final Cut, for example. And that's just something that I've toyed around with on my own, but generally the rule is the shutter angle is twice the frame rate. I will generally film on the G9 in the natural setting, and I'll turn contrast down, I'll turn sharpness down, I'll turn the saturation down a little bit, and then I'll add some of those things in post. And the reason why I like to do that is, and a lot of filmmakers do this, is because rather than baking those things into the image as it's being written to the file on the card, I really sort of want the cleanest image possible off the sensor that I can get, and then I can choose in post to add those things to my taste. But the camera isn't deciding those things for me and then baking it into the image and then making it more difficult for me to work with in post. So I really like to dial those things back, and you essentially do that by creating your own custom picture profile in the camera to be able to do that. We're always filming in 4K. That's just something that really appeals to me as a filmmaker. It gives me a lot of flexibility in post to do other things. It does mean a lot of extra card space out there in the backcountry, but whenever I'm editing something, I want to start with the best possible image quality that I can get out of the camera to begin with, and then I'm going to work with that through to post. Now, another reason why I like to film in 24 frames per second as opposed to 30, for example, is because if you look at a lot of cameras, they're actually filming at the same bitrate in 30 as they would at 24. And what that effectively means is if you film in 30, that bitrate is being divided among a few more frames per second of video and effectively applying a little bit more compression per frame of video. And if you were to film in 24, it means that bitrate is being divided among fewer frames per second and effectively giving you slightly more quality with less compression per frame of video in that second. So filming at 24 is a way to just squeeze a tiny bit more image quality out of your camera. So now that we've gone through all the gear that I take with me into the backcountry and some of my settings and the lenses that I use and why I use them and what frame rates I use and why I use those two, I think it's really important to leave you with this. You do not need all this stuff to tell a great story in the backcountry. Please don't feel like you need to have this stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've watched other YouTube videos. I follow all the big channels out there that tout the latest and greatest tech. And don't get me wrong, they're great channels to follow, and I love following a lot of them, but often sometimes when I watch them, I feel like, oh, I don't have that latest and greatest lens, and that person does. And then you start to feel like you need to have it. For some people, that means they don't start because they don't have the equipment. They don't have what they think they need to get started. And that shouldn't be the point at all. You can start with your cell phone. You can start with that camera that's already on the shelf. And just to give you an example, when I started filming our channel, and more specifically the first Algonquin series that we filmed on YouTube for YouTube, I had a lot of the latest and greatest equipment. I had full frame cameras from Canon, really expensive high-end stuff, L-series lenses. I left all the really expensive gear at home and I took this. And I started our Algonquin series in the backcountry with this little $200 point and shoot. This is a Canon S120. Believe it or not, this camera taught me a lot about filming in the backcountry and leads me to what's most important, which is the latest and greatest camera equipment will not make you a better filmmaker. Working with limitations will make you a better filmmaker. Trying to get a better image out of this, or using a camera like this and forcing you to tell a more compelling story rather than portray a more compelling shot, will make you a better filmmaker in the long run. So don't pine after the latest and greatest gear. Pine after limitations and use limitations to your advantage. So I hope my little story about starting our vlog with this Canon S120 will make you feel better about starting with a gear that you already have. You don't need the latest and greatest. Give whatever you have a shot. In any event, I hope you found this useful, and as you can probably see, the sun is starting to rise, so it is definitely time for me to go to bed now, and the white balance is starting to go kind of crazy. But thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this useful. Again, a huge thanks to the folks at Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And to you folks at home, please stay safe, be kind to yourselves, be kind to others. And until next time, thanks again for tuning in. See you next time. Bye.